Alright, let's get started. So as you can see, we're talking about preprocess functions. Today we'll be talking about Drupal 8 mainly. Going to just talk about some differences between Drupal 7. I'm Chris. I work at CodeQualis here in town, probably 2 miles from here. And let's see, my slides are on my Twitter, and you can see some tools, some pages that I'll reference here that can help you along the way. And at CodeQualis, like most developers, we like watching The Office. Any Office fans? And along with that comes pranking your coworkers. One day when all the women were out of the office, my desk was moved into the women's restroom, and I could not find it, so that was fun. But I did get my own office that day. No one could bother me. So today we're, like I said, talking about preprocess functions. They're great. How many of you know or have used them? Probably most of you. Yep. So we'll be talking about what they do, how to use them, and some helpful tools and tips to make life easier in theming and in Twig. And you can't really see the background very well. That's fine. Let's see. So preprocess functions are modules in core and contrib release and serve up data that will be rendered on the page. And if you need to change how that content's rendered, what information is served up, or add some custom logic before it hits the page, preprocess functions are what you're looking for. The main role for them is to set up variables to be used in the template. And these variables can be simple Boolean values to complex renderable arrays. And most of the logic should be kept in the theme file instead of in the templates. Back in Drupal 7, people were notorious for just throwing all their logic, if statements, loops, in the PHP, in the templates, which gets cluttered when you have developers coming on a project and don't know where things are coming from. So we'll be talking about that and how to keep your code clean for future developers and yourself to have a good time. So debugging is essential in Drupal. The easiest way that I'm going to talk about and will help you along the way is to turn on debugging in your services YAML file. That's going to be found in your site's default folder. If you don't have a services YAML file, there's a default services, and you can just copy that, create your services YAML, and then down here under Twig, just turn debug to true, and that is going to give you a lot of options when viewing the page. So now you'll see templating suggestions, theme hooks. Really, this just helps you know where things come from, where they go, and how you can change them. So some examples of that. Can you all see that pretty well? So this is just a simple example. This is for a region on the page. This shows you right here what template it's using currently, what theme hook it is, so this is the region, and the file name suggestions, so what templates you could use if you wanted to change this more dynamically per page. So another example, more complex, this is for a block we're rendering. These are the different templates that you could use. If you added that, it would change this specific block, and this is the current block that we're rendering here. So turning this on really helps you a lot, because if you don't know where something's coming from or how to change it, how do you change it? This is just another example for a block. Really, without theme debug, it's hard to do anything. So in Drupal 7, you have the template.php is where you do all your preprocess functions. Drupal 8, that's not a thing. Now we have the .theme file. So in the root of your theme, you will have thename.theme is where you put all your preprocess functions, your logic, like I said, to keep it out of the templates. You should keep that all out of there, just so, like I said, it's easy to know where things come from, and you don't have crazy logic in your Twig, because nobody likes that. So the function, or the format for preprocess functions, is theme name, preprocess, hook, where hook is the theme hook of the element that you want to preprocess. So at their simplest, you could just do theme preprocess node, and that would give you variables for the node. You could do theme preprocess page to change things on the page. But if you wanted to change, say, a field, a details element, an input, a filter, you can get very specific, and those Twig debug comments will show you how to use that, show you what hook to use. So here's an example here. So if you wanted to modify radio buttons, I'm using here the Better Exposed Filters module. Does anyone use that? It's really good stuff. Well, the Better Exposed function, Better Exposed Filters radios, will give you this, and the theme hook here is BEF radios. So if we wanted to hook into this and change either the file name suggestions, what content's given there, add some classes to the divs wrapping around it, we would use theme preprocess BEF radios, and instead of doing the theme preprocess node or page. So you can really do this for any element, like I said, an input, just a little input on the page, a field. You can narrow this down specifically to preprocess really anything on your site. Now, how do we view these variables? In Drupal 7, we had the devel module, and that gave us the dpm command. And basically in the PHP, you would say dpm, wrap it around the variables or whatever you wanted to show. And we've come a long way since Drupal 7. Now we still have the devel module, and that's given us the kint function and the ksm function. And those are nice. They're good. They're better than dpm. You can even change the color, the theme in the devel module of how those look. I've never personally done that because who wants to theme a developer's life? It just makes it easier, I guess. But xdebug is where you're going to get a home run. Xdebug, basically you just set a breakpoint in your code and it'll give you all the variables you need. And so if you haven't used xdebug, there are blogs, articles by JetBrains. My coworker, which I'll reference the link in here, wrote a blog on how to set that up because it can be a little tricky. So like I said, with the devel module, you would put your variables inside the kint function or the ksm function. Clear the cache. Always clear the cache. It won't work if you clear the cache. I'll say it again. The cache needs to be cleared. And you probably all know that. Navigate to the page and you'll profit because you'll see all the variables that you need. One thing that's great about these functions is that they actually have tabs, so you can see your variables in one tab. Then you can see all the methods and functions you can use off of those variables, such as if you were viewing a user's variables, it would say you can use this method get name, and you can get the username by using that. So they're handy because they expose all of those methods so that you can better have an understanding without having to dig through 3 pages of docs on what methods are available to you. So that's going to look a little bit like this. It's ugly, but it works. So here I've done a preprocess and exposed the node variables, and so you have a lot of things here. You have the elements that are on the page. If the user's logged in, content attributes, classes, theme hook original. And here is just more of that. I couldn't get it all on the same page. This shows you what view mode you're using. So if you wanted to use an if statement, if you're on the teaser, change these variables. If you were on the full page, use these variables. It even tells you what URL you're on, so you could be very specific with things that you change. And just more, the theme hook suggestions, I'll get into that a little more later. But basically you can change the naming convention, and that's helpful. Here's another one, just more examples, entity type node, and these all expand and show you just further on things that you can use. Let's see, just more examples. It's really hard to put it in one slide when the page is this long. All right, so xdebug. What I really want to talk about. Has anyone used xdebug? Awesome. So you already know it's amazing. What do you guys use it for? PHP Storm? Which IDE?
PHP Storm.
PHP Storm. Awesome. That's what I use it for. I just recently got it set up on VS Code. I haven't tried it yet, but apparently it works really well in there. So in xdebug, you just like in JavaScript, in a JavaScript debugger or console, you have your code here, and it's going to step through that when it loads the page. So you can add breakpoints to stop the code, and it will show you every variable that's available to you in the code. So in this, we're going to add a breakpoint in the function, clear the cache, run xdebug, and navigate to the page. And again, you'll profit. With xdebug, it's not going to show it on the page like it does with Kint. It'll show it in your IDE, your code editor. And it's really nice just because you can step through every step. Let's say you have a loop or an if statement, and it will show you what variables are available throughout every step as you're going through the loop. So it's really handy. And setting up xdebug, it's not that crazy. Like I said earlier, I have references to some blogs and articles at the end of the slideshow, which you can find on Twitter, that show how to set it up. When I first started using it, I was scared because I had no idea what xdebug was, but it's not terribly difficult. So here, now that I've shown you what this all is, I'm going to talk about some examples that you can do with preprocess functions. So if you wanted to add classes to an element or a wrapper around an element, a div, a page, sometimes, as we all know, getting classes in certain places is tricky, especially when you have div, article. It's pretty hard sometimes to do that. So in a preprocess function, there's inside the variables, there's the classes array, and that's an array of classes that basically just all the classes that will go on that element on the wrapper. And you can remove classes from it. You can add them to the array. You can change the order if for some reason you wanted to do that, just to make your markup look better. And what that's going to look like, here's a little complex example. So I'm doing a preprocess HTML, and I'm adding the class of administrator to the body if you're an administrator. So I'll step through this just so you can see what all this is doing. You have the preprocess HTML, and if the element user variable is set, so if they're not an anonymous user, we're going to continue stepping through the code. And then at this point, I'm getting account variable is going to be the user object that I've gotten from the variables elements user, and from that you can grab the user ID and you can load that user with that ID, and from that, with the user object loaded, you can use the method getRoles to get the role off of the user. And at that point, down here you just say if administrator is in the array of roles, then we want to add to the end of this array the class of administrator. And that's handy if you just want to do things on the site that regular users don't see. Maybe make the site look all GeoCities for the admin, but not for the users. Here's another example. If we wanted to add a title of a filter to the class of the filter. So we have here variables element type. I've gotten this if it's a radio button or a checkbox, and as you can see, like, you can be very specific with what you're editing, what you're changing in your preprocess functions. Myself, I love preprocess functions, and I just wish I could stay in the theme file pretty much the whole time. So we're getting the variable's title off of the filter. And then we're going to strip the title dashes to make lowercase so that we can add to the class without spaces in it using preg replace, and that will change the spaces to dashes. and then we're just adding that to the class variable. This is another thing that you can do. Instead of just adding classes, you can add libraries to specific elements, and this is handy just so you don't have certain JavaScript library, CSS library, component on your whole page. You can only add it to one little section of the page. So we have here, we're using a preprocessed block. I haven't specified it to any specific block, but you could say only on my homepage Facebook block add a caching library, or whatever really you wanted to do. In this instance, I've added the slick slider to this block because we don't want the JavaScript for the slick slider or your flickety slider or any slider just all over the page, because it will bog down your site with performance and make it a lot more slow. So you can add this specifically to the block, to the view that you want to use, and save the rest of your site some time. Next, I want to talk about renderable arrays. We're going to talk about creating them, calling them, and why you would use them. So they're better to use than just writing HTML, because it's an array of data that tells the page to render HTML. Now, why would that be better than just writing HTML? Well, if you had a developer come to your team and they wanted to change this block, but it was all HTML, and they didn't know where that was, or if you had a contrib module with other people using the code, they'd have to just hard code the HTML, and that's not good for the future, for streamlining your code. With renderable arrays, people can hook into it. They can change just minute little things along the array to just very easily using a preprocess function, rather than having to hard code HTML every single time, and nobody likes that. So in the end, you're writing reusable code. So here's an example of a render array. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. I'm creating a user info array, and it's going to be an HTML tag, and the tag type is div. So I'm creating a div, and I'm adding 3 classes to it. So this is really just a wrapper div, very basic, but this is basically how you create an array. And as you can see, if somebody came along later, they could use a preprocess function to change this specific array and change the type or the attribute classes, rather than having to go in the HTML and remove a class, which is not fun for anyone. If you wanted to call that, if you wanted to add that to your page, you could say variables content user info, and then add a Facebook link inside that div. You can add other arrays inside these arrays, which just makes it kind of a scaffolding that is just reusable, instead of just having that hard-coded HTML like I was saying. And I think this is actually an example of xdebug. Yes, it is. That's very ugly. Bear with me. You can't see black on the screen. So this is just this is similar to the Kint and KSM earlier. This shows you the user. You get the global variables here, the caching. So you have elements, which is elements on your page, and that will contain the content, or just strictly inside the variables there's also content, which is the same. You can change title prefixes. You can check if you're the admin. That's another way to check. If the user is logged in, they should see such and such. So really you have all these things available to you that you can change things on the page. And this is just another example. Inside the elements, you have the user object, the view mode, what theme you're using, the entity type, and this is inside the content variable. And so these are all the fields that I have on the page that have content in them. So if you wanted to, let's say with field user phone, if you didn't have a better way to do this, somebody added a phone number with dots, but you just want dashes on your site. You could open up the variables to any field called field user phone, and then you could use a PHP function like Preprocess to strip periods and change them with dashes. Some other examples, if you just wanted to remove a field because your client no longer wants a bio on the user, you could do that. There are lots of examples. You can check if it's sorted, etc. Let's see. So now that I've shown you what xdebug does, you see its value now. So now we're going to talk about how you call these things in Twig. What does that look like? The syntax, how you would do that. So this is a renderable array. It's very simple. I have here just an if statement. If content user info is has data, then we're going to render that. So what this does is, inside content, we use dot notation. So in variables, content, we have a renderable array called user info inside content. So variables, you wouldn't call that in Twig. So anything inside the variables would be the first word here. So we're using content, and then we're using the dot notation, user info, to call that inside content. Next I want to talk about theming template suggestions. I showed earlier, it showed you what template you could possibly use, the names, and which ones you were currently using. In some instances, it's tricky because you get to the page and the only available template name is node.twig or node.html.twig, and that's not helpful if you want to say on the contact page, change something. So this allows you to add a specific template naming suggestion format. You can add in the page name, the title, the author into the template naming suggestion. This can be used globally, or like I said, it can be used for specific cases. So only if you're on a certain page, change the template name. And what this looks like here is hook, theme suggestions, hook, alter. So that will be your theme name, theme suggestions, hook, so node, field, page, alter. And what those look like if you look at it through xdebug is this. These are just some of the theming suggestions that are already there. And if none of these were specific enough for you, you could change it. Here you have field node homepage, so that may be specific enough. But if you did want to change that, then you could come into xdebug, figure out what page you're on, add some if statements and loops, and change it. Let's see, just more examples of xdebug. Alright, and here's what it looks like in the code. So in my theme suggestions, container, alter, container is the hook, so we're only changing container elements. Man, I forgot how tricky these are. So theme suggestions function, alter functions use suggestions and variables. And to do this, you have the pieces variable, which you basically, Drupal, how they do it is they'll have 3 different pieces. So you'll have like node, page, front.html.twig. And they'll piece those together with underscores. And then often they will have a prefix of container underscore underscore all of this. And in PHP this is a little tricky, not really. In template names they will often use underscores, but on the page they use dashes, which doesn't really make sense. But in PHP we use underscores, and then somewhere along the way it gets converted to dashes for you to use on your page. So here, as you see, we have these pieces. We have the type of element, the name of the element, the display ID, and then we are adding this together as one string to the suggestions variable as a new suggestion for you to use as a template name. So like I said earlier, variables will be called by their associative key. So variables footer will be called footer in Twig. If you throw it inside content, it would just use dot notation like I said earlier, so content dot footer. And you can use if checks in Twig, just very simple. If content dot footer has content is available, display this. That's pretty much as much logic as you want to do. You can get a little more complex, but without doing loops and stuff, you should just keep that into the theme file. Next, I'll talk a little bit about modifying forms. So this gets a little bit out of the reach of my presentation, as it's not pre-processing, but it's doing form alters. But they kind of work hand in hand, kind of change things on the page together. So modifying forms, if you wanted to add a link to a form, you could do that. If you wanted to, let's see, change a field, put two fields together, have a hidden field that pulls data from another field, you can do all of those in a form alter. And form alters, what you change on the page will show up once you get to the page. So it won't be dynamic necessarily. As you're changing things, the form alter changes. That won't really happen unless you use, the state variable does have some of that data. As we're all told, and as I should always tell you, be careful not to leave your site vulnerable to cross-site scripting attack. That usually happens in forms, and as I know from all the certifications, it's very important. So this is the xdebug from a form. Just some of the things that you can see here. You have the form ID, so you can do an if statement to specify we're on this form. You have the name field, the password field, the attributes, which would have the classes in it. You have your validate functions and your caching. And your attached is where you can add like JavaScript or CSS libraries to, if you want to slap view onto a form to make it more dynamic, that's where you could do that. This is just more of that. The form ID, the method that it's using, the submit function. If you modify that, you can say like, hey, send the data over here before you finally submit the form, or you can add validation checks to say like, hey, if they didn't add something to a certain field, you can stop them and make them go back on the form. So what a form alter looks like, you have form, form state, and form ID in your mytheme form alter. There's also mytheme form hook alter is a function. Instead of using if form ID, you could use mytheme form user login form alter instead of having a bunch of if checks inside your function. So what this is doing here, we have the form variable, the form state, and the form ID. And so we're saying if form ID is user login form, we want to add this key to the form variable, sign up, and that's just HTML for a link. That's a very simple renderable array. You probably shouldn't add that much HTML in there. You can if you want, but this is for the demonstration. Form alters are fun too, just because you can change how they render on the page, how they look, and how they act. So today we've talked about preprocess functions, what they do, how to use them, and helpful tools and tips to make your life better. On this last page, you can't really, if you want to write those down, you can. But yeah, we have debugging, so I have a couple articles here about how to set up Twig debugging, template suggestions, and render arrays. It doesn't look like I have those xdebug docs on there, but I will tweet them out after this. And now you can say you're the coolest people in the world. So, do you guys have any questions?
Yeah, when you got any real idea why you would use hook form ID over hook form alter with a check inside of it?
I mean, it would really just be how clean you want your code to be. It'd be easier to say if you had your page with a bunch of functions, you have your form contact alter, your form user login alter. They'd be more separate and easier to find. But then again, if you just have a form alter with a bunch of if checks inside it, that would be easy to find too. So really, it's just up to you which way you would like to do that. Yes, Becca?
I've read that using the form ID alter is more performant. I don't know if that's true.
Oh, really? Well, there you have it.
I wondered if there might be a slight performance increase, but I wouldn't.
Yeah.
I'm not really timing this stuff. So.
Right. I mean, it would make sense just because it doesn't have to run the if check because it knows this is the form I'm altering. Anyone else?
I saw that you added a library through with the preprocess, and we went to another class where they added a library through their YAML file.
Mm-hmm.
Which one is that? Is there one that's better than the other?
So in the YAML file, I'm not sure. I think you can do it either way. But in the preprocess function, you just add it there. You would have in your libraries YAML, you have them all defined,
Yeah.
and then you can just call it on the specific element in the template page. Yeah.
And do you know of a good blog or article for adding xdebug to Sublime text?
I can find one for you.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure they have plugins or extensions, whatever they're called in Sublime, that work with xdebug. Then it's just figuring out how to get it running. But yeah, I'll add those to the slide and then tweet it out.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. So you guys enjoying Kansas City food?
Yeah.
I'm used to it.
Yeah. I mean, I live here and I'm enjoying it. So. How are we doing on time?
Do you ever have instances where you have multiple functions and you have to connect them in some way, like have a global variable that has to work within different functions?
Not necessarily, not that I've run into, but I mean you could write your own functions and then call them through the preprocess functions to run.
Question about like how do you keep your .theme file like organized when it make it like too big with different stuff going on?
That's a good question. So I mean, with comments, obviously that helps you organize it, but generally, I don't know if this is rule of thumb or just how we've done it, is like near the top we'll have the theme template suggestions, then in between that we'll have all of our preprocess functions, starting with like node page as like the bigger objects and kind of like funnel down towards the bottom, and then below all of that you could add your form alters and just really whatever works best for you, but without just throwing them all in there.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I'm really new to Drupal and new to the project that I'm working on, but this particular project was set up, and I don't know how, but we have a preprocess directory, and then we've broken out our preprocess
Files.
Yeah, into different files.
Really?
Yeah.
That's cool.
So I don't know how it's set up, and something else maybe you don't really.
Yeah, I think
It can be done.
I think you could do something like that if you wanted to have like a module that maybe is everything at the beginning or something.
To go to your point, we have them broken out like between the different types of preprocesses and what they're trying to do, like blocks, regions, forms, and those are included into the actual into the theme. So it's just a way of separating it out. It's nothing too fancy.
Yeah, it's easier to work with.
A little more organization.
Yeah.
You can break it out even further if you wanted, but it's not going too crazy.
Right.
I could see that working if you have like tons of preprocess function.
Yeah, like if you're doing a lot of, I don't know, pre-process functions for like queries or something before they load to the page.
Another thing that's fun is if you have like a REST API or using the JSON library, instead of just getting your content from Drupal, so all of that data is coming from the cloud or the decoupled library, and it's coming into your site, and pre-process functions still work on those, even if like it's not coming from your Drupal site, which is cool because it still gets rendered on the page, so you pre-process it, and you can change how that renders. You can even just scratch some data, modify it on the fly before it reaches your page, since the pre-process is between the data and the page. Or decoupled, somebody was talking the other day about like the reverse of decoupled. So which I think it was a Drupal front end with something else as a back end. So I was wondering like if that would be called coupled, not decoupled, how that would work. Not sure how you would want or why you would want to use Drupal as your front end with something else as your back end, but maybe it's useful. I think that's all.
All right.